incredible how much the music we listen to directly connects with who we are as a person. But I think, unfortunately, fans of metal and other more extreme genres of music are often completely misunderstood and pretty unfairly judged. People seem to automatically assume that they are aggressive or unstable or even unintelligent, but that is usually quite far from the truth. So in this video, we are going to explore what personality traits are actually linked to a preference for metal based on science instead of stereotypes. To do this, I'll be summarizing multiple peer-reviewed empirical research studies on the topic, which I will of course link the citations for in the description box in case you want to read them for yourself. And each of these studies utilized the 5-factor model of personality for their research, which is widely accepted as the gold standard in personality psychology and also my preferred methodology, so I feel very confident in the findings. However, before we dive in, it's super important to remember that we're talking about correlations here and not causation. What this means is that certain personality traits seem to draw people into heavy metal music rather than the music somehow creating these traits in them. And as we're all aware, metal is just a huge genre with tons of subgenres, so there also might be subtle differences because of that factor that weren't really addressed here. And also, in the end, we are all different. So if you feel like an outlier after hearing all of these conclusions, it certainly doesn't mean that you are any less of a fan. So with all of that being said, let's dive on in. Now, out of the big 5 personality traits, which are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, openness to experience is by far the most consistent and strongest link to liking heavy metal and other intense rebellious music. When someone scores high in openness, it means they're intellectually curious, they love adventure, they're open to unusual ideas, they have a great imagination, and they're willing to try new things. My own score in this trait is nearly at 100%, and I think when we think about metal, this connection makes complete sense. I mean, the genre is known for its intricate musical structures and complex arrangements and emotional intensity. These qualities naturally appeal to people seeking meaningful artistic experiences and intellectual stimulation. And in addition, high openness is often linked to a broader appreciation for art in general, and the distinct sound of metal and everything it represents, which is undeniably unconventional compared to mainstream music, seems to resonate in particular with those who are drawn to non-traditional ideas. I think we can clearly see that connection here. But what about the other traits in the Big 5? Well, while they do not have nearly as strong of a connection to metal music preference as openness does, they did find some pretty interesting connections. So let's go ahead and go through them one by one, starting with agreeableness. Now, the studies fairly consistently showed a negative link with agreeableness, meaning that people who prefer intense and rebellious music do tend to score lower in this trait, which I know kind of sounds like it's just reinforcing the stereotype or may just seem highly inaccurate, given that metalheads are usually a lot nicer than they look. But when we look at the actual facets of agreeableness, it actually makes a lot more sense. Lower scores don't necessarily mean that someone is rude or unkind. I mean, it can, but it can also mean they might just be more skeptical of others or more direct or more likely to challenge authority or value nonconformity, which we already know have strong correlations. So I think that's what we're really seeing here. I think these traits actually align with the values that are often celebrated in metal culture, like honesty, independence, and standing up for what you believe in. So overall, it's not necessarily even a negative reflection. I think it just points to a stronger emphasis on authenticity and resistance to social pressure. Okay, let's move on to conscientiousness, which showed another negative link. Now this one had a weaker correlation, but lower scores in this trait might be connected to being less organized or less disciplined, or on the positive side, a more spontaneous or flexible approach to life, which is quite different from the more structured, rule-following tendencies that we see in highly conscientious individuals. I think this does help explain why people who are drawn to heavy metal, especially the more chaotic and more experimental subgenres, may indeed score a little bit lower here. However, just like with agreeableness, lower conscientiousness does not mean a lack of values or ambition. In fact, the studies actually acknowledge that many metal fans show deep commitment to their music and community and their beliefs, just not always in ways that look traditionally disciplined from the outside. So let's go ahead and move on to the trait of extraversion. Now, unlike the clear patterns we see in the traits we've talked about, extraversion doesn't show a strong or consistent link to liking heavy metal. I know we always hear anecdotes about metal fans being more introverted or even antisocial, but the scientific evidence for a strong connection just really is not there. Some studies did show a mild correlation with introversion, but as far as being antisocial, that could not be further from the truth. And in fact, that is not even something that is directly linked to being an introvert. In actuality, many fans find a really intense sense of community, identity, and belonging in the metal scene, whether they are introverts or extroverts. But let's go ahead and move on, and the last trait that we need to look at is neuroticism. Now, I will admit, at least from everything I've read, that the relationship with neuroticism seems to have almost conflicting findings. Some studies showed a link with slightly higher scores and suggested that people high in this trait might actually be drawn to intense music for catharsis and to help them manage their moods and negative emotions, which I can definitely see. But believe it or not, some research also showed that metal fans actually have similar or even lower rates of mental health issues like depression or anxiety compared to the general population. Either way, I think this points to something that fans already know, which is that metal usually serves as a healthy coping mechanism rather than a reflection of underlying problems. That being said, however, the relationship between neuroticism and metal music is obviously complex and very deserving of further study. So to wrap things up, I think it's pretty evident that the personality profile of heavy metal fans is much more nuanced and fascinating than the negative stereotypes would have us believe. And I was not at all surprised by these findings. I would love to hear how your own personality traits align with these conclusions, and if you're not sure, I definitely recommend taking a comprehensive 5-factor personality test, which you can easily find online. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Please do me a favor and like and subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next video.